everyone. I'm Ronan Murphy. Delighted to have you joining us for today's webinar on governance, risk and compliance and data, and two really special guests who've been in the industry for a long time, and looking forward to getting their words of wisdom when it comes to all things data, technology and governance, risk and compliance. We've got Tim Ayling from Imperva. Imperva, super exciting company. Recently got to meet your chief executive, Pam Murphy, here in Cork. And I think what you guys are doing is really inspiring in terms of the whole data security world. And obviously we've got Anthony Lyons here, Chief Operations Officer, Getvisibility. And a bit like Tim, Anthony's been in this game for a long time and definitely going to share some very interesting perspectives with us when we talk about data and governance and risk and compliance. So I guess to set the scene, one of the questions I regularly get asked, I spend a lot of time talking to analysts and talking to CIOs and to CISOs and to people in leadership positions in many different organizations in many different parts of the world. And they ask me what's happening out there, you know, what are people worried about? And I think I always break it down into a couple of key points. Obviously, at the top of the list, you nearly always have ransomware, right? You have ransomware, you have double extortion ransomware, you have triple extortion ransomware, where the bad actors are going after the data, right? So that's kind of front of mind. But there's also a lot of other challenges. There's IT teams who are overstretched and under-resourced and are struggling to get budget to deal with these problems. You have a lot of pressure from a regulatory framework perspective, both at a macro level and at an industry vertical level, whether it's healthcare or manufacturing or retail or finance. You've got a big degree of modernization or digital transformation taking place with people investing in new technology. And obviously all of that brings a lot of risk. And then if you look at the type of traffic that's traversing the internet, I mean, the amount of, it's something crazy, and Tim will probably talk to this in a moment, but the amount of API traffic that goes over the internet now is something crazy, like 70 or 80%. And a lot of organizations aren't even sure what traffic is connecting to their applications or to their infrastructure, which ultimately is connecting to terabytes of data which they hold. We've got huge problems with bad bots, these different bots that are trying to compromise organizations, from credential stealing to account takeover. And that leads to a lot of problems like social engineering and phishing and abuse of different systems. And then organizations are asking questions of where is our data, who's got access to our data, what data is sensitive. So it is a complex problem. There's a lot of things going on in the background. And to help me shed light on it, as I said, I've got Tim and Anthony who are hopefully going to get us some sort of roadmap to get to the end of these problems. I guess we'll start off, Tim, I might go to you. Can you tell us a little bit about Imperva? You guys are making a massive splash in the whole data security world. I was at RSA in San Francisco, and every time I looked sideways, Imperva were winning a new award for some of your technology and your capability. So if you could maybe tell us a bit about you guys, and where you're going on this whole data security, governance, risk and compliance capability.
Yeah, sure. So Imperva have been, around over 20 years, starting really with, we're well known for things like WAF, especially cloud WAF now, and data security. So they're kind of the two core areas that we've been focused on in the past. But we talk about protecting data and all paths to it. So actually, we start at the edge with things like DDoS and CDN. Then we look after the applications themselves through WAF, through API security, through bots that you picked up upon earlier. And then the data itself, where we have a lot of capabilities around, not just traditional DAM technology, which we're very strong in, but far broader than that, including encryption, including tokenization, including analytics on data as well. So we like to think that we're looking after the security from the edge right through to the data. I think the industry's been very good at protecting the past of the data, and for a long time have ignored the data itself. I always kind of think of Dr. Phil. His quote was, how's that working out for you? And the truth is, as you said earlier, it's not working out too well. So that's why I think there's a much bigger push for security of the data itself. And I don't just mean encryption tokenization, because, you know, I think there's an argument to be said on that side. It's a kind of form of access control now. Yes, the data is encrypted, but if you've got the credentials, you're in. So then it's about analyzing the use of the data. Are you using it more than you normally would? Are you using it more than somebody in the same position would? So we're seeing a lot of traction around the analytics of data security.
Okay, thank you for that. Anthony, can you tell us, can you maybe share your overview and Getvisibility with us, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ronan. So Getvisibility, like predominantly, we are an artificial intelligence company, and we use AI and ML to bring value to our customers. And that value is getting visibility into their data, understanding their data, understanding who has access to that, understanding what is happening to it, and basically, as one of our taglines is, to take ownership of their data. So our real skill set, though, is in the artificial intelligence. We have a dedicated data science team who have probably the best mind. Our leader has probably one of the best minds in AI field at the moment at a global level. And we use a couple of different AI strategies to bring that value to our customers so that they can get great insight into what data they have in their estate, be that on the cloud or on-prem, and being able to protect it and regulate against it.
Sorry, I was on mute. So, okay, so if we were to try and simplify the overriding problem here, gents, we have a very punitive regulatory framework, both at a macro level with GDPR and CCPA, but also very complex regulations at an industry vertical level, right? So if we look at, let's take financial industries for a moment, right? Whether you're an insurance company or you're a bank, I would probably argue that they have more granular and problematic regulatory mandates from their central banks than they probably even have from data protection regulators at a national level. And some of the complexities that I see would be that in many cases, the ability to align the governance, risk and compliance folks in an organization and the cybersecurity folks who deploy the tools and, you know, ingest the analytics and are responsible for the outputs. I often find there's a misalignment between those two divisions within an organization. And the cyber guys are overstretched, under-resourced, and the GRC folks are asking for, you know, best-in-class security. So I guess, Tim, I'll start off with you. Do you share my perspective that delta exists between these two different stakeholders within an organization? And is that changing or is that evolving with technology?
So 100% agree. Without, you know, working for, let's say, a bank and being in that situation, I couldn't tell you if it's changing. You'd hope it would be. I mean, they kind of have different objectives, really. You know, one is to kind of meet the regulatory needs, and the other is to keep the organization secure, and they don't always match. I mean, I come back to, and this 10 years ago, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who was a CISO at an investment bank, and she told me she only really cares about three things: budgets, regulation, and visibility. So, well, she said, when something goes wrong, I need to be able to tell my boss. So those three things, I think, is where the cybersecurity function looks at. So in that sense, you know, the objective around regulation is definitely aligned to what they're doing in the GRC team, but I'm not sure that the budgets are quite as well aligned. maybe that's changed in the last 10 years, but I know cybersecurity, we see in the industry, you know, the budgets are not massively being cut, but they're not being increased rapidly either.
Sure. So if I were to say, Anthony, if I was to make the presumption that cybersecurity and data security are different, because when you look at cyber, right, you've got people who are responsible for implementing the WAFs and the EDR and the different tools that are responsible for protecting the infrastructure. But if I talk about data security, you could argue there's a lot more stakeholders involved in the decision-making process. There's a lot more complexity. There could be a lot of different jurisdictions. There could be a lot of different contextual understanding to what data types are. I mean, this is eminently more complex than cyber, or is it? I mean, what's your view on that?
So I agree. It's almost like the GRC team and the team that looks after compliance and regulation, in a perfect example, such as a bank, they live in one bubble. And then you have the cybersecurity team, who are, historically, I think, have been kind of outward facing and looking at like external threats that are trying to get in. But really the data is the key. Understand it, like having a protection mechanism around that. And yes, governance has an input into that, but governance runs at a lot slower pace than the cybersecurity team. And cybersecurity should absolutely encompass data security, and governance should absolutely encompass data security. The two things are running at different paces because of the different priorities and the different bubbles they live in. But it's essential that the one commonality between them is the security of the data. It's the crown jewels for the company, which means that the regulators want to make sure that an upstanding company, be it a bank or a law firm, have proper measures in place that things are protected in a proper way, but also from a cybersecurity perspective, because in a breach, if that's going to be stolen, that's the first thing that's going to be looked at. Exfiltration, double extortion, as you say, and you need to know what's on that data, who has access to that data, and is that data of high importance to you, or is it low importance to you? What's the classification of that data?
It's really interesting. You mentioned the point, Anthony, that security is looking outwardly, and then you've got the data security team separately. We find that absolutely 100%, which is if we map it to the Imperva message of data and all class to it, the data piece is a completely different buying persona to the other piece. It's very difficult to map, and it's obviously the challenge for us, but it's such a challenge for CISOs and the security folk that we deal with.
So gentlemen, let me play out a scenario, okay? And in this scenario, we mentioned at the start, I'd like to talk about bots in a moment, right? But we know that approximately half of all internet traffic is bots. And we know approximately half of all of that traffic is malicious bots, right? Everything from Grinch bots to, credential harvesting bots, right? And we know that those bots are hugely successful. That's why they exist, right? And that's why every time we hear of a major cyber or data breach globally, you could argue that it's probably as a result of a bot. And somebody clicked on a link and the credentials got harvested, and then it went down a layer to the more sophisticated attack, whether it was social engineering or credential or profile escalation privileges or whatever it might be. And when these guys get in, they're obviously very proficient at their ability to navigate their way around the network. They might deploy a tool like Cobalt Strike. They might identify where the data repositories are. And then because they've got escalated privileges, their ability to move data and to, set up FTP of that data off-prem, or to identify data repositories that haven't been secured, becomes very easy, right? Because they're inside, they've bypassed all of the security controls that are out there. And in many cases, they'll even know what tools are being used to monitor, anomalous behavior. So if they're successful in exfiltrating this data out, who gets fired? Does the DPO get fired? Does the CIO get fired? Does the CISO get fired? Because there's a bit of a disconnect, right? Whose job is it that, you could argue that the CISO did a great job in implementing the tools and so forth from a perimeter perspective, but is it his job to understand that there's an Excel file, or there's been an export from a database with a ton of information that's sensitively regulated and so forth? I want to really tease this out. Whose ownership is directly responsible for this actual data?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it really varies depending on the organization. So that particular method that you talked about kind of uses API and bots to take the data itself. So that suggests that, well, two things actually. It suggests that the perimeter isn't as well protected as you'd think. You know, they found a way in. But also it suggests that maybe there's not enough security awareness within the organization. And, you know, I'm from a vendor, but if you haven't got your security awareness right, you know, there's only so much that technology can help you. I know within Imperva, we're regularly being tested on cybersecurity because it's kind of our business now, but it's regular. And also it's a big problem, this APIs connecting to data. You know, we're seeing in future regulations, like we think in PCI 4, that when a breach occurs, you're going to need to know as an organization who accessed that data and who took it. And at the moment, it's pretty typical. If you come in through an API or through an application, you don't know. And that's the kind of the new frontier of data security, is actually linking the two together.
Have you any examples of where you guys have gone in and you've been asked to look at the API integrity of an organization, and you know, where someone assumes they've got 500 APIs feeding into their data store, and it's turned out to be something drastically different? Is there any examples of that?
You know, so we have lots of examples like that, but I'll give you one with a name, which is Imperva. So we turned on our own API security and found 2,000 unknown APIs that we had no idea about. So you know, and we talk openly about this. You know, we're a cybersecurity company. We implemented our own technology and we found all these APIs. So, you know, in the great scheme of things, Imperva are not a massive bank. You know, we're not a huge company, and we found 2,000. Now we've got lots of customer examples where we're talking hundreds of thousands of unknown APIs, and you know that it's, again, it's all part of the modernization. The thing with COVID is what was called transformation. You know, a 6-year project had to happen in 6 months, and we've kind of retired the term transformation and moved to modernization, because now they've done all this kind of all this transformation has happened, and now they actually need to make it secure. And that's kind of where we're at right now. Is companies don't know what APIs they've got. They don't understand the bot traffic that's hitting them right now. It's just happening, and there's no real security around it.
Yeah. So Anthony, solution this out for me, right? What we've learned is that of the vast majority of the internet traffic worldwide is either bots that are trying to steal our data or get access to us, or it's APIs that we either know or don't know about. And it sounds to me like it's overwhelming in terms of the challenges that are faced. And I mean, in my mind, a lot of people are going to take the ostrich approach to this. They're going to say, look, we've got good firewalls, we've got good antivirus. We're now going to bury our head in the sands. And when people ask us, are we secure from a regulatory perspective, they're going to say, yes, we're secure. Is this problem solvable? And if so, how?
Yeah, and I go back to two things. One thing that you said in your introduction, which rings very true, is all these teams are overstretched. They don't have the capacity to take on the amount of work and the amount of effort it is to get your arms around this problem. They need tools which have the ability to work at scale. And you know, AI tools is the way forward, the only way that you can move forward through this. Utilizing artificial intelligence and utilizing that everybody knows about it now since ChatGPT and has an idea of it, but you know, this is the cutting edge technology. It's the only way that we're going to be able to analyze data at this scale to be able to get our arms around it. So
let me challenge you on that for a moment, right? It costs $1 billion to build a ChatGPT. Someone's going to pay for that.
Yeah, it does.
If I'm a mid-sized company and you're telling me that ChatGPT is my solution, I know that of that $1 billion, they're going to want payback. So let's talk about economies of scale here.
Absolutely. So and this is it's a great way to kind of define artificial intelligence. So you have your large language models, you have your very broad, wide horizontal language AI models like ChatGPT. These are great at providing, answers in natural language, and great at being able to emulate, a human. But you are able to narrow this down, and one of the technologies that we use is narrow model AI, and you are basically distilling the intelligence that you have in these really expensive, really costly large language models down into a more strategically focused and more vertical focused AI model. So you don't need to have this behemoth of a multi-billion weighted AI model. You can distill this down into a multiple narrow AI models and target at a specific vector. So target at a specific vertical. So you can tailor an AI model to look at, say, for example, when it comes to like GRC, you could look at an AI model that's specifically looking for PCI data or PII data or PHI data, and you don't need to have all the robustness of that large language model. It can be narrowed right down, and that's an approach that we at Getvisibility use. We use a lot of narrow model AI to basically define exactly what data we're looking for, and it's far more cost efficient, far quicker, and far more accurate than using large language models in it.
Super interesting. Tim, can I ask you, right? You guys, I mean, you're growing at a phenomenal rate, right? And I was fortunate enough to recently meet your CTO and also your CISO, Kunal, and we shared a taxi ride, and he was telling me about how you guys have built, some of your capability to deal with runtime applications and the move it vulnerability.
Yeah.
Because in certain circumstances, organizations have that in an air-gapped environment or on their own private cloud and so forth. So the natural updates coming from the vendor were not applicable to it. And you guys had some very interesting capability around those types of vulnerabilities, because I guess why that's important is that the exploitation of that vulnerability left, it resulted in direct data exfiltration from very large global brands, right? Which is this ransomware we're talking about. But instead of it being a bot, it was the exploitation of a vulnerability in a widely used enterprise application. Can you maybe share how your perspectives on how Imperva deal with that challenge?
Yeah, it's and that comes back to, which we haven't really mentioned, with supply chain.
Yeah.
We're all reliant on third-party applications. That's just a fact. Now, some people say with things like MoveIt, and before that there was Log4j, and all these things, some people say, well, that's the responsibility of that vendor of that application to fix. But you go to a CISO and tell them, actually, don't worry about it. It's not your responsibility. It's the application. I think the CEO probably has a different view. It's just like, well, this is a fundamental part of what we're doing. We need to protect that application. And so that's a broader problem with supply chain right now. Now, in terms of what we're doing for it, yeah, so you can block some of this stuff using a simple WAF, and we do. It's not real time though, so it's not an immediate. You need to write a rule and you need to implement it. Now with our RASP solution, you can basically put a wrapper around the application and say, you know what, this application can only do 1, 2, 3. These 3 things. Anything else, we want it blocked. And that's exactly, very simple, but that's exactly what it does. It's able to block things that an application is not meant to do. So real 0-day vulnerabilities in applications, you're protected from 0-day. So it's it's a big thing. Sure, now for us, obviously Move IT came and we were like talking a lot about that, but it's only one in a long line of similar vulnerabilities that have happened in the past.
Okay. Anthony, if I were to come to you tomorrow and say, look, I'd like to understand if we fell victim to a ransomware attack, right? If they managed to subvert our security controls, we fell victim to a bot, they got access to a user, they escalated credentials, they deployed Cobalt Strike on the wire, and they got to map out what our network looks like. I want to understand what the blast radius looks like. What's the damage I'm going to have to deal with? Can you talk through that scenario on how you would help mitigate that risk? Because you're talking about AI, you're talking about narrow models, you're talking about large language models, and the technology is very sexy. But when the rubber hits the road and you actually have to talk about risk mitigation, what does that practically look like?
Yeah, so it when it all boils down, it all boils down back to the data itself and
by the way, let's talk, like, when it comes to the data, you've got the large databases. I mean, we've lots of companies now looking. When we work with Imperva, they could have hundreds of different databases in different database formats. It could be NoSQL, it could be Oracle, it could be other types of databases, some old legacy stuff that Tim loves. I can see him smiling. You've got the unstructured data flying around in SharePoint and Dropbox and OneDrive and Box, on network access storage, on endpoints. Then you've got dynamic data in real time that's been created, that's being exported out of the database, that's being edited, that's been shared. You've got all of these different data types that are flying around. And ransomware attacks are indiscriminate in nature once they escalate privileges, right? They'll go after everything. So let's use that as the problem statement and tell me how we fix this.
Yeah, so getting to the core of it, like, so your unstructured data is probably the most difficult problem to solve. So to understand what that data is should be the top priority for any organization. Understand what data you have, understand who has access to that data. So you have unstructured data on your SharePoint, your OneDrive, your Google Drive, you have it on your endpoints, you have it on strewn across every sort of data store that you possibly have in an enterprise, including databases and everything that you can think of. And to get an idea and get your arms around it, you need to be able to accurately and quickly assess what is that data. Is that critical information? Is that proprietary information? Is it containing my intellectual property? Is it containing some PHI? It's critically important to understand what is that data and who has access to that data. So when you encounter a situation where you have a bot who takes credentials, the average, out of interest, like the average time that there is for somebody being breached and then realizing there's a breach, it's around about 250 to 280 days. There's somebody in your network floating around before they press the button to encrypt your data or steal it. So understanding what data you have and where it is a first step in mitigating any problem that you may have with an attacker that's in your network unknown to you for that 250 or 280 days.
So how do you do?
Because you're doing
how do you? So I get the concept, right? How do you do that?
How do you lock it down, or
no? How do you understand what your data is?
How do you understand it? So there is only one way to be able to get a complete understanding of your data at this scale, and that's by utilizing an AI model to be able to scan and assess what is in that data. So say, for example, at Getvisibility, we have tools which will look at your OneDrive, okay? And we will be able to scan your entire OneDrive estate, classify and find all of the data that's there. Utilizing your own taxonomies that we build using custom taxonomies for each customer, we're able to identify what's intellectual property, what's maybe confidential information, what data should definitely not leave the organization, and what data is internal only. So we're able to assess that very, very rapidly, very, very quickly, using these narrow model AI tools that we have. And from there, you take the next step of understanding then who has access to that data. So why, for example, has somebody in IT access to a load of HR data, or why has somebody in the engineering department have a load of access to, maybe government sensitive data that should be only accessed by regulated people. So you can find all of this and discover it. And this is the first step in understanding, when you do get in a situation where you're breached, what that user has had access to. So maybe my credentials are stolen. What access have I got? Show me all of the confidential data that this person has access to, so I know what our exposure is, what our blast radius is, and really what our protect surface should be. What is the data we should be protecting?
So understand where it is, understand how sensitive it is, understand how it flows, understand who's got access to it, and then understand how secure it is.
Exactly.
And then you understand the blast radius. So
You're at an apex. You're at an apex of governance and compliance and cybersecurity there, because part of governance, and just touching a point you said earlier on, who gets fired, who's the throat to choke when there's a breach, the compliance guys are probably going, well, we were all compliant, so I'm off talking. The cyber guys are kind of going, well, we did everything we possibly could, but here it is. The data is at the apex of both the cybersecurity and the governance and compliance piece. And that's why it's so critically important to understand what your data is, how important it is, who has access to it, and what's happening to it.
So thanks, Anthony. Tim, if we're to talk then about the database, right? The database is the engine of the company. It's what's driving the business. And that stuff is high stakes poker, right? You don't want to make a mistake on the database, and you certainly don't want to lose a database, right? It's bad enough to lose a bunch of, Excel files, but if you lose an entire database, it's you're on the BBC News, right? So how is it that you guys, how is it that you secure the database layer?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot to that. I mean, first of all, I could copy and paste some of what Anthony was saying in terms of, it's amazing, even with databases, it's amazing how many organizations don't know what data they've got. They don't know who, even the stuff they do know about, they don't know who's got access to it, and quite often, I'm sure it's happened to us as well. You kind of need access to some data for a week. So you get access to that data, and then you forget about it. And who goes back and says, hey, I don't need access to this data anymore? It doesn't happen. So we kind of help with that as well. So we can go in and say, we can look at all the data. First of all, we can go and find the data. So let's start with that, and then we can classify it. But then we can go in and say, okay, look, here's who's got access to what. Does this person need it? And also, what vulnerabilities do you have within your databases? So that's kind of like, that's where we start. Where it gets really interesting is around the analytics, because we can look at, this is strange behavior compared to how you would normally behave. This is strange behavior compared to what your other colleagues are doing who should be doing the same thing.
So if I access it, let me give you an example, right?
Yeah.
If I log into our ERP system at 2 a.m. in the morning, and I suddenly start transferring information about whatever new drug we're building, right?
Yeah.
And that's anomalous, right? That's an anomalous bit of behavior. What does Imperva do if I initiate that type of engagement with a database?
So first of all, that's exactly what I'm talking about. That's exactly the kind of things we'd spot. And then it's kind of what do you want to do with that? Because you can go all the way up to blocking the access if that's what you wanted to do. A lot of organizations are hesitant with that, but that is definitely an option. But where it actually becomes very interesting is with NIST 2, there's a requirement to report very, very quickly. And I think I read that it was even for the very best in class organizations, it takes about 61 days to get the information that they're going to need for NIST 2. And I think the requirement is 30 days. So most organizations by default are not going to be in compliance. But if you've got analytics on the data, and suddenly you can go into Data Security Fabric, you can see exactly what's happened with the data right now. So you can take that 61 days down to a few hours. And so that's where it gets really interesting. And again, where it hits both GRC and information security, because the IT security guys love the fact that they can have the visibility to see what's happening. And the GRC guys love the fact that you're...
So Tim, and I really like where you're going with this, right? But I would have always assumed that the predominant use case for Imperva would have been DSARs, right? So somebody rings up, I want to know what information you have about me in your database, and you guys go in and you're classifying the data, and then you can help with that DSAR and potentially the remediation or the deletion of that information. But I mean, you're talking about more interesting aspects now of the database, right? Going into the UBA of it, and I mean, it's a very interesting use case. This one of people going, because a bit to Anthony's point, I mean, the big problem with the unstructured stuff is there's a lot of information coming out of the database into the unstructured world, and that's flying around on desktops and so forth. So you guys are trying to identify if that unusual behavior is happening within the database.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And as you say, the database is kind of the core of where an organization lives, and it's got more complex, of course. We talked earlier about modernization, but back in the day, you'd have a few Oracle databases and that would be it.
Yeah.
But now it's everywhere.
It's multi-cloud, it's everywhere, it's every type. Plus, I think probably more problematic, you've lots of old databases thrown in, right? With different use cases that are applicable to them.
You've still got mainframes, people forget about that. We're all marching to the cloud. But people forget that actually mainframes are still very dominant in certain industries. And also one trend we've seen is a lot of companies have gone to the cloud with this promise of reduced costs and suddenly realize, actually the cloud providers are providing security for the cloud. They're not providing security for your data. And actually the costs were a lot higher than they'd have envisaged. And so that I wouldn't say there's a march back on-prem, but there's a trickle back on-prem as well.
What did I hear recently? If you're not born in the cloud, you're insane. And if you stay in the cloud, you're more insane.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, the costs creep up on you, right? This cloud business isn't cheap. It's a bit like the LLMs, right? But there comes a point when there's a really valid discussion to be had whether it makes sense to stay in the cloud or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is exactly what we're seeing. And so the complexity, I mean, you talked a lot about databases, and kind of I instantly think Oracle, SQL, that kind of stuff. But the reality is a lot more complex than that. And the ability to support multi-cloud, mainframes, standard databases, and so on is where we're obviously very strong because that's what we do. But it's also becoming more and more important to organizations. And I don't know many organizations that are single cloud as well. So, multi-cloud.
There's none. Every organization now is multi-cloud. Anthony, can you talk to me about shadow IT or let's call it shadow data? Talk to me about shadow data and why is shadow data such? I don't even know if that's a term. I might have just invented it, right? But is shadow data, why is that such a problem?
So when you say shadow data, you mean like data?
Well, actually, let me pose the question a different way, right? Let me pose the question a different way. Let's take the most secure facility on planet Earth, right? The Pentagon. And how is it that Edward Snowden could walk into the Pentagon with all of the best security that's available? And I'm sure they had DLP and they had access rights and they had identity control and they had everything you can imagine. But nonetheless, he had the ability to look at either data or shadow data and successfully exfiltrate that out of the Pentagon and do whatever it is he did with that data. So whether that's shadow data or some other type of data, can you maybe share your perspectives on that, on why, when an organization even attempts to implement the very best controls, where did they go wrong if they did go wrong, and how is it possible to address that?
Absolutely. So I was reading recently about 20% of breaches that are happening now are insider threats. And Snowden was an insider threat, and it's the classic insider threat, an insider who, for one reason or another, be it a bit like Snowden, or be it, they're moving on to a different company, or they're disgruntled, they will likely, the biggest way that they can cause an impact is by taking data. And this leads back to the grand old adage of having to understand it, and having to understand what is that data, what is on it, and who has access to it. It's very, very easy for an employee to hand in their notice and go into a file share, and maybe a file share that they shouldn't have access to. They have a file share that's just open to all of the company that might contain an Excel spreadsheet with all of the customer names and addresses, and they just copy and paste that onto their USB key. It's a huge vulnerability. It's a huge gap. And in an awful lot of organizations, just the simple understanding of permissions and permissions management leads to these types of exposures. Employees, the insider threat is a huge threat, and it's an awful lot. It's a lot of the time it's overlooked again for the external threat. Everybody sees the big bad outside.
Could I argue that maybe the problem that Snowden created for the Pentagon would have been relatively easy to mitigate that risk? I mean, if you identified, a bit like what myself and Tim spoke about a moment ago, if you identify that there's sensitive information which contains the names and addresses of CIA operatives or whatever it is, and if that's classified and tagged and as metadata, identifying it as that specific type of information, the controls for it to be copied or pasted or moved would immediately fire off some sort of anomalous alert to the security operations center or to whoever it might be. And is that a control that was possibly overlooked?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Not having an understanding of the data, not being able to manage it correctly it was the root cause. It's completely the root cause. And it's I know Snowden was over decades ago now, but it's still a huge problem for enterprises today. And it all kind of leads back to a few of the topics we were talking about earlier on. Overstretched enterprise IT teams who just don't have the time to eat this elephant. It's a huge problem. There's data that's out there that's years old. And again, maybe against compliance, they shouldn't have, PHI or PII data that's in their organization that's over 7 or 10 years old. And IT teams just don't have the ability to find that data and identify who has access to that data and understand what's on that data. And should it be deleted or moved to cold storage or do something based on their compliance? They don't have the ability to do that because they're under-resourced, they're overstretched. They absolutely need the abilities of artificial intelligence, narrow modeled AI to focus on exactly the data that they want to find and protect, and be able to put the ring fences around it, the guards around it, to prevent the insider threat like the Snowdens and things like that. It's an absolute essential at this stage.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Sorry, Tim.
Sorry, yeah, just to add to that, for me, Snowden was there's a couple of things about the Snowden. One, it kind of comes back to what we were saying earlier, which is organizations prioritizing the path to the data and then forgetting about the data itself, and that was a real case of that. And secondly, I mean, at the time it was all DLP was going to solve everything, and how many DLP projects do we know that failed? It never reached the promise, and that was a prime example. Snowden managed to get the access. DLP was, gave him the access, so that's fine, and he could do what he liked. Job done. So yeah, there were a lot of failures, but the biggest one for me with Snowden was they didn't look at data security; they looked at securing the path to the data, and that isn't sufficient.
And another good one was the Panama Papers. The Panama Papers was an email dump. It was all from Exchange, from Outlook, from emails, and the Panama Papers was probably equally as disruptive of a data leak. And again, it was emails that weren't being classified and weren't being tagged, metadata tagging and being protected. All of this is an essential in today's world.
So gentlemen, let me talk about a way forward, right, for organizations here. And when speaking recently, Tim, with Kunal, your CTO, he said to me that he believed that the specific geolocations globally who are leading the way in ensuring that organizations get their house in order were Australia, New Zealand, Southeast Asia, possibly followed by the Middle East. And he felt that, North America and Europe were probably 2 to 3 years behind in terms of getting the regulations that are going to really get organizations up to speed from a regulatory perspective in terms of data and the types of reporting around that data and potentially the auditing that comes with that data. Do you agree with that perspective, or have you had any exposure to those other markets?
So, I lived in Australia for 8 years, and I ran APAC.
I didn't know that, by the way.
Yeah, good setup. And I looked after APAC as well. So I think especially in Asia, and especially Singapore, to be honest, that's definitely true. If you look back at banking in the early 2000s, the first regulation around adding two-factor authentication to online banking was Singapore.
Yes.
And the rest of Asia soon followed. So I have a lot of sympathy with Kunal's view. But from my conversation with him as well, we're seeing a lot of activity, certainly around supply chain in India. That seems to be leading the way. I guess they're a nation of developers, so there's an understanding in that nation about the importance of supply chain as well.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Anthony, do you have a perspective on that? I mean, obviously, just opened offices in Singapore as well.
Absolutely. We recently opened our office in Singapore, and we definitely see that it's a step ahead. The understanding and the insight that customers have in the East and in Australia and New Zealand is certainly a step forward than Europe and America. I think there's a culture piece to it, and it's probably just been around that much longer that it's more ingrained in the culture. But in Europe and America, there's a kind of Europe and America, there's a step back from it. But that will change, and that change will come. It's a necessity.
Yeah, sorry, Tim, yes.
You mentioned the Middle East as well, and the Middle East is a huge market for us. And the reason for that is in their regulations, they literally stipulate DAM.
Yeah,
they don't give any monitoring. I mean, it's there. No organization can exist without DAM. We don't have that. It's kind of like, there's a lot more manual processes that an organization can have in our part of the world.
Yeah, Riyadh is Anthony's second home. Yeah. He spends every second week out in the desert.
I'm getting familiar with the city. All right.
I mean, but look, an interesting one, Anthony, right? Let's talk about this for a moment before we wrap up, right? I mean, a big part of AI and a big part of the development of Getvisibility has been building the multilingual functionality. And of all of the languages in the world, probably one of the most difficult is Arabic. And a lot of the feature set and the delivery has been for some of the very large ministries in Saudi, right?
Absolutely. I'll just say it again, our data science team is world class, and we have a multilingual AI model, and a lot of it was driven because of the necessity and the requirement from our customers in the Middle East and in Asia to be able to understand data in Arabic in particular, and in multiple different languages, because in the APAC region there's a huge multitude of languages. So our multilingual ML is really finely tuned on languages that are not English. I'll put it that way. We're very much advanced when it comes to being able to understand documents and being able to understand context in non-English text, and it's a very difficult challenge to meet. But as I say, our head of AI is world class, and they've spent a significant amount of time in solving this problem. So it's been a great success, particularly for our colleagues in the Middle East.
Okay, so Tim, before we wrap up, right? If a company, the first 6 to 12 months of implementing the data security capability of Imperva, what do they look like? Where have they improved after 6 months, 12 months? Why are they in a better security posture after utilizing your technology?
Yeah, I mean, I come back to what Anthony was saying earlier. Typically we start with a fresh organization, let's say, with discovering and classifying the data, because it's amazing, as I said earlier, it's amazing how many organizations don't know where their data is, shadow databases and all sorts. So in the first few months, that's where we concentrate, is let's know where your data is. Let's know what data you've got, how you should classify it, and then we can go from there. And then after that, that's when we start looking at the analytics side. And I would say, 3 to 6 months is about right for implementing the analytics as well. So, but you can't do that until you've classified your data. So that's absolutely key for us.
Okay, Anthony, same question.
Same question. So, I completely agree with Tim. Everything's all about the data, understanding your data, being able to put your arms around the problem. That is the essential key. From a Getvisibility perspective, we go in, we search all of the unstructured data that the enterprise has, and we always, without fail, are able to shock and surprise the customers within a week, going, "Oh, I didn't realize that was there," and I didn't realize that person had access to that data. It's a perpetual piece of feedback we get, and every enterprise has the same problem. We're just delighted to be able to be part of the solution for them.
Okay, guys, on that note, can I thank you both for a really interesting discussion. I think there was a huge amount of synergies in what you were both saying, and I think it's clearly evident that the data layer is the next frontier in terms of both cybersecurity and all overall risk mitigation. And while it's been around for a while, and it's funny that we're talking about something that happened 15 years ago with Snowden, but I think it's becoming more prevalent than ever given the nature of the threats that we're looking at. So on that note, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.